and I will allow the state to make closing arguments. The defense will have an opportunity to make closing arguments, and the state will have an opportunity to respond. Ms. Starnes, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. We started this process, about 2 weeks ago? And if you recall, we promised you all that if you sat on this jury, you would end up knowing way more about this crime than anything that's going on outside these doors, or that's in the media or in the paper or online. You all would know more about this crime than anybody. And I hope that you agree that that's correct. You know by now that it's unfair and it's inaccurate to just call this the American Sniper trial. It's unfair because while Chris Kyle was phenomenal at his job, the true measure of a man is way more than what he does for a living. The measure of a man is more than just his job. Chris Kyle was a father, a son, a brother, a husband, and he was a friend. But you also know that to call it the American Sniper trial is inaccurate because it wasn't just one person that was killed out there at Rough Creek Lodge, it was two. Chad Littlefield, while he wasn't famous, he never wrote a book, didn't have a movie made about him, he was also a father, a husband, a brother, and a son, and a friend. He was Chris Kyle's friend. 2 people were killed out there at Rough Creek Lodge. 2 people were murdered. And that's what makes it capital murder. And that's why we're here today. Chris and Chad were friends to each other. And they made it a mission in their life to be friends to other men in need, to be friends to veterans, to men that needed to go outdoors, do guy activities together, feel the therapeutic value of being outdoors. And if you're into guns, that's therapeutic to you. But don't you know that that friendship that they had for each other and that compassion and friendship that they were showing to men like Eddie Ralph, and including Eddie Ralph, is ultimately what cost them their lives? Don't you know that that need for compassion, that need for friendship, that instinct to show that friendship and compassion to men, caused them to override any kind of sense of self-preservation? Don't you know that that need to be Eddie Ralph's friend that day is what made them override any kind of little, if the hair on the back of their neck ever went up, their need to be his friend overrode that instinct. Because don't y'all know by now that somewhere along that ride out to Rough Creek Lodge, Eddie Ralph let his true colors show, let his freak flag fly to some degree. We don't know what he said, if it was that comment about Whataburger or something else he said along the line, but he said something that caused Chris to send Chad that text, "This guy is straight up nuts." And Chad wrote back, "He's right behind me, watch my 6." We don't know what was said that caused them to say that. We also don't know that they're not kidding. Well, we all know that texts and emails and that kind of thing sometimes don't, if you look at it in black and white, you don't see sarcasm or humor in that. We don't know what they meant. But don't you know that anybody who's met Eddie Ralph, if they drove by and saw him out there driving his VW Beetle painted by a ladybug, saw him out there working on it, how many people do you think said, "That guy's a nut"? How many people do you think saw Eddie Ralph at the store wearing Jen Weed's clothes and her pink Argyle socks and said, "That guy's nuts"? Probably a lot of them. But don't you know, whatever went on in that truck on the way to Rough Creek Lodge, it wasn't so alarming or scary that Chad and Chris said, "Hey, Eddie, I just got a text from my wife. My kids had an emergency and we got to go back. We got to go, the kid's going to the hospital. We got to abort this trip." That was never said. And it certainly wasn't so alarming that they didn't get to Rough Creek Lodge and then just say, Let's leave the rest of these guns in the truck and just shoot the handguns. No, they got out all the guns. It certainly wasn't so alarming that they didn't put a loaded gun in Eddie Routh's hand. But we're not here to blame Chad and Chris for their deaths. We're here to blame and hold accountable the man that put 12 or 13 bullets in those two men. That's what we're here to do. We're not here to fix the VA system. We know that that's a screwed up system. We can't fix that here in this trial. That's not what we're here for. We know that the healthcare system for the mentally ill is not perfect. We all know that. We know that mental illness is scary and it's disruptive and it causes a lot of problems in people's lives, and it's very real. That's not our job to fix that whole healthcare system today. What is our job today? We've spent the last 2 weeks, you people have disrupted your lives and gone out of your way to give Eddie Routh a fair trial. And we've sure done that. You all have certainly done that. Your job today is to follow this oath that you took when you became a juror on this case. And to follow that oath, all we're asking you to do is take the 9 days of evidence that you've heard, the 9 days of evidence that you've seen, the law that Judge Cashin has given you in this jury charge, and look at that evidence, look at the law, and then just follow the law. And let that guide you to your true and correct verdict. Now, we told you in jury selection that it's always going to be the state's burden of proof to prove to you that the defendant committed the offense of capital murder. That's our burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Did he do this? Did he commit capital murder of these two men? Well, there's not a whole lot of debate about most of these elements. I don't think there's any disagreement that this is February the 2nd, 2013. I mean, we know that's the day that they died. They were found out there at Rough Creek. But let's go through some of these. We know that it happened in Erath County because you remember Deputy Keith Martin, who works for Somerville, he says he knew as soon as he passed that little rock cottage there and you get up to the lodge, that's Erath County. He had passed into Erath County. Frank Alvarez told you that. He's the general manager. He pays the tax bills. He knows that where this happened out at the range is Erath County. There's no dispute about that. Well, we know it's the defendant. He's the one that did the murders. I mean, how much more clear could it be? We see him driving his victim's truck, getting out of his victim's truck, holding his hands up. This is not a whodunit case. We know he shot him with a firearm. Well, there is the .45 that he killed Chris with. And there's the 9mm that he shot Chad with in the door pocket of Chris's stolen truck. We know it was the same criminal episode because there they are. Dead at the same time, found dead at the same time. They were alive and breathing, just who knows, within an hour or so before they were found. Let's talk a little bit, though, about the intentionally or knowingly aspect of a murder. Now, y'all remember back from when we did jury selection, throw out anything in your mind about premeditation. That is not part of Texas law. That's California law or some TV law. We don't have that. There is no requirement in Texas that we prove any kind of crime, even capital murder, was premeditated. We have to show that he killed these two men intentionally or knowingly, and that's it. And you remember when we talked about in jury selection, intent can arise in a minute. Something can happen, but what is going through his mind when he pulled the trigger on that gun, pointed at those men, and pulled the trigger? What was he thinking? Well, you know that it's not an accident, it's not a mistake, it's not reckless to shoot Chris Kyle 6 times. And Chad, either 6, according to Howie Ryan, that one went through the back of his head and then into his shoulder, Dr. Bernard was counting that as 7. So he shot Chris 6 times, and he shot Chad 6 or 7 times, depending on if you think that one re-entered or not. But that was deliberate, that was calculated, and that was cold. That's not any kind of accident or mistake or being reckless. And what did he do? What was the timing of all this? Well, the defendant, even according to him, what he told various people, he waited until Chris's gun was spent before he started shooting. He waited for the opportune time. What does that tell you about his intent to kill these men? He waited for the opportune time. And how did he shoot him? He shot Chad in the back. Twice, at least. Shot a man in the back. And then quick succession, he shot Chris in the back of his shoulder. That's the one that goes through his spine, through his aorta, and caused massive bleeding. He shot him in the face. That's the one that went through his spinal cord. And in quick succession, he shot him in his shooting arm. You know, why can the skilled marksman not shoot back? He's shot and broken his shooting arm. And you heard from Dr. Bernard and Howie Ryan that this man that was this awesome skilled marksman who survived 4 tours of duty in Iraq and came home unscathed, died face down in the dirt at a luxury resort shooting range, bleeding to death. But you also heard that Chad's death was not as quick. That after he shot Chad in the back, he then shot him in the back of the head. And you know that from the evidence of Chad being shot in the hand, that he had to have seen at least one of those shots coming and shield his face from that gun. And you know that Chad was on his hands and knees, bleeding, when he reached out and ran his fingers through that pool of blood. And then you know that as Chad lay dying on that ground, on that shooting deck, that he went around and he shot Chad in the top of the head and in the face, not to prevent him from getting up, but to finish him off. He didn't just want Chad dead. He wanted Chad dead, 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 dead. And he wanted the same for Chris. What did he tell Dr. Arambula? If you're mad at Chad, why couldn't you just kill Chad? Because he knew if he did that, Chris would come after him. Chris would kill him. So he had to kill Chris too. And then what does he do? After he kills these 2 men and leaves them bleeding to death at Rough Creek Lodge, he stands over Chad's body, or right near it, on that deck, and he reloads that 9mm, puts 15 bullets in that magazine. And you saw when Mr. Jeffries was here, how long does that take to put 15 bullets in that magazine? And he reloads it. Why is he reloading it? What does he need a loaded gun for? For a shootout later with the police? He took that one because it was a trophy. That's the one that has the Navy insignia on it. And then he stole Chris's truck and he flees the crime scene. He wasn't just conveniently going somewhere else, he was fleeing. He had to get away from this bloody mess that he had just left out there at that shooting range. He even used this word when he was asked later, "What did you do?" "I fled." What does that tell you? Then he went to his sisters and he said, "I just committed a murder. I'm in too deep. I'm going to run to Oklahoma to get out of this mess, that bloody mess that he left at Rough Creek Lodge. Then he goes to Taco Bell for his last free world meal of 2 burritos. Got his dog that he loved, because you know he's not going anywhere. He's not going to go to Oklahoma or leave town without that dog. He got in the armed standoff with the Lancaster police while in Chris Kyle's stolen truck. He got in a high-speed chase. Oh, and then he confessed. Confessed to Ranger Briley, confessed to the New Yorker reporter Nicholas Schmidl. He confessed to Deputy Gene Cole. Remember what he told him? I shot him because they wouldn't talk to me. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, we also have scientific evidence linking him to the murders. Most tellingly, we have Chad's blood, Chad's DNA on the defendant's boot. And what does that tell you? Remember when Howie Ryan was testifying? He's standing over Chad, shooting him in the head. And you saw him on that video how he tucks his pants into his boots. He's got Chad's blood on his boot. So to know whether or not this defendant committed this capital murder, what are we doing? We're looking at his actions and we're looking at his words. And we have overwhelming evidence that he has committed this capital murder. We have proved to you beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed this capital murder. Way beyond it. We showed you that he did it in a cold, methodical, calculated way. It was awful, it was bloody, and it was a senseless crime. But just because something's a senseless crime doesn't make a person insane. So now we'll go to their burden of proof, is to prove to you that he was insane at the time of the murder. Remember, we don't have to prove that he was sane. They have to prove that he was insane. And if you're going to, and it is a preponderance of the evidence, and I'll give you that. It is a lower standard of proof than did he do it. But what have they brought you? Have they met their burden of proof? No, they haven't. Because remember when we talked about during jury selection, if you were going to take a human life, if you are going to stop a beating heart of another human being, then you have to fit this very narrow definition of what is insanity under Texas law. It's not just part of it. It's not like Dr. Dunn wants you to do and just, oh, well, he has this, and let's ignore all of that. It's all 3 of these things. It's all 3 parts of that definition. That's what you have to squeeze through, that narrow definition, to avoid criminal responsibility for taking the lives of 2 other human beings. Who did they bring you? They brought you his family members, his employer, his girlfriend. They brought you Dr. Dunn. And I'll give you that Dr. Dunn has credentials as a qualified psychiatrist, but he seems to want to ignore the great weight of all the evidence and all the common sense. And to him, it seems like it all stops if you believe him that the defendant is schizophrenic. And he wants to ignore everything that shows by everyone's common sense that the defendant knew his conduct was wrong. He was wrong about, Dr. Dunn was wrong about a lot of things. He sat there and told you, oh no, he didn't test positive on that January 19th hospitalization. Yeah, he did. I showed it to him. Okay, he made a mistake. Who did we bring you though? We brought you 2 extremely qualified expert witnesses, Dr. Price and Dr. Arambula. And Dr. Price has been at this 30, 40 years. He's board certified psychologist. He gave the defendant over 10 tests there at the jail. He spent over 10 hours interviewing the defendant. He's been a college professor. He's been at this for years. We then brought you Dr. Arambula, who is a board certified psychiatrist, a board certified forensic psychiatrist. He's also has a doctorate in pharmacy and has actually practiced as a pharmacist before he went to medical school. And he's the president of the Texas Medical Board. Guys who know what they're talking about. Very credentialed men. And he also spent over 3 hours talking to the defendant. And what do they tell you? Well, Dr. Price tells you that the defendant is just a naturally suspicious person. He's got paranoid personality disorder. That's just part of who he is. He's suspicious about people. He's one of those people that thinks somebody's always trying to do him dirty. Oh, and then add to that, though, extremely heavy marijuana use, alcohol, frustrated with his life. I mean, who wouldn't be frustrated if you lived his life? He had a fight with his girlfriend, jealousy, irritation, feeling slighted, and what happens? He murders Chris and Chad. And Dr. Price tells you that he has what's known as cannabis-induced psychosis. Yes, it's rare, and we're not talking about, some reefer madness. You use one joint and you go, cannabis-induced psychosis. We're talking about somebody who uses a whole lot of marijuana regularly. Yeah, he has some mental problems, but they don't rise to the level of severe, according to Dr. Price. But the bottom line, too, for Dr. Price is the defendant knew what he did was wrong. First of all, his cannabis-induced psychosis, like the name implies, is a psychosis caused by voluntary intoxication. And so he can't then get over here and say, oh, well, I'm claiming insanity. Why? Because voluntary intoxication is not a defense. If you ingest something, a mind-altering substance, and you go and commit a crime, you don't get to say, well, I wasn't, I have an excuse. I was intoxicated. You can't say that. And you also then can't make yourself become with psychotic symptoms because of heavy marijuana use and alcohol, and then say, oh, well, now I'm insane, because it was caused by the voluntary intoxication. The bottom line is the defendant knew what he did was wrong, according to Dr. Price. And then he's setting up his defense, like he's done many times before. He commits a crime, he does a violent act, he gets wasted out of his gourd, and he goes to the mental hospital. And that's what he wanted to see happen again, the night of February the 2nd. He was setting up his defense. And then he comes up with this preposterous pigman hybrid pig story that he tries to sell to Dr. Dunn, and apparently did sell to Dr. Dunn because he fell for it hook, line, and sinker. And you reasonable people of Erath County know that that story about the hybrid pigmen and the pig assassins is a load of hogwash. Then Dr. Rambula came and told you that, first of all, he does not have a severe mental illness. He's got some mood disorder, probably some depression. And he was voluntarily intoxicated. Game over. It's all intoxication, according to Dr. Rambula. But, just in case there's still a question, Dr. Rambula tells you that he knew what he did was wrong. And he's faking it. As you remember, he used the term secondary gain. People lie to get out of trouble. They don't lie to get into trouble. And every lie that Eddie Ray Routh tells is him trying to get out of trouble. So let's go through what is some of the evidence that he was voluntarily intoxicated. We know, we heard it from all these kind of people, even his friends and family, even his sister. This is a family where it's their culture. They're marijuana smokers. Jen Weed told you that he smoked a lot. Everybody says that about him. What do we find at his house? We found this little tin with the pipe in it. Remember Uncle Jamie? He said, oh yeah, that's the pipe we smoked out of that morning. We smoked a couple of bowls out of that pipe. He even took a whiff of it and said, yep, that smells like marijuana to me. And he should know, he told us that. He's been smoking it since he was a teenager. Then what did the defendant tell Ranger Briley? What's in the bong? Some pot? What else is in it? Well, it's probably laced up with something else. You know, you can't trust anything here in Texas. It's usually laced up. What would have been laced with? Probably some of that wet, which you heard is either PCP or formaldehyde. You know, what do you mean by that? Well, it could have been anything. I mean, don't you know that's the nature of street drugs? You don't know what you're getting when you buy something off the street. What was it laced up with? What kind of wet? What are you talking about? Maybe Purple Hearts? Maybe formaldehyde? This guy knows the drug culture. He knows the street lingo for drugs. We heard from Uncle James. They smoked a couple of bowls that morning in that pipe that he identified. Now, for some reason, he wants to say we might have drank some whiskey. I don't know why he wants to deny that, because Eddie tells everybody we drank whiskey that morning, and you saw that almost empty whiskey bottle on the table. What did he tell Dr. Dunn? He went through a lot about his history of substance abuse with Dr. Dunn. Significant history of alcohol abuse. In high school, he would smoke 2 to 3 days a week, used hydrocodone and Xanax, drank 30 packs with a couple other guys in the military, and then after the military, at least every other day would smoke marijuana with his mom and dad, sometimes a joint before dinner and one after. And he admits to experiencing paranoia when he smokes marijuana. Then what did he tell Dr. Dunn about the second? That he drank whiskey that morning? Oh, and then he denied smoking marijuana to Dr. Dunn, but even Dr. Dunn believes that's a lie. And then he told Dr. Price he smoked marijuana the night before, drank whiskey the night before, drank whiskey the morning of February 2nd. Again, he denied to him that he smoked marijuana that morning. I think everybody agrees that was a lie. I mean, the uncle came in here and told you, yeah, they smoked together. But then to Dr. Rambula, he got into great detail about his marijuana use, talked about how he liked the very potent variety of marijuana, the hydro. And he would get high with every additional smoke, and it would last 4 or 5 hours. And then when the effects would start to wear off, he'd reload. Talked about how he sometimes would go to work high, and it didn't affect him because he had such a tolerance. But then he told Dr. Arambula about February the 2nd that he was smoking marijuana with his friend, Greg Lindemood, his dope dealer, and they drank whiskey too. And Jen Weed tells you that too. That she caught him and Greg Lindemood the day after he got out of the VA hospital the week before, sitting around smoking dope and drinking with Greg Lindemood. He said he felt suspicious that night. And then he was writing the notes to Jen, hey, let's cook up a batch of pot cupcakes and we'll make money selling pot cupcakes. That doesn't sound like any kind of psychosis. That just sounds like a guy that's stoned. Drank more whiskey. But then that morning, he tells Dr. Rambula, he got up early, drank some vodka from the freezer, drank whiskey when his Uncle James came over, smoked some leftover marijuana, and then we know he smoked some more with his uncle. The guy's intoxicated. And remember, we're talking about 3 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, after all of this going on in the morning, drinking and smoking. He didn't have to still be high at 11 o'clock at night. We're talking about, is he under the influence of some substance 3 to 4 in the afternoon when he kills these men? Yeah. You can't drink all that and smoke all that and not have some effect. But if you don't believe that, let's just look at this insanity defense. And what does it say? Like it says up here, we're looking at the time of the conduct charge. As a result of a mental disease or defect, did not know his conduct was wrong. Now, certainly this number 2 is in dispute. Dr. Price and Dr. Ramblin both have told you it's not a severe mental disease or defect that he has. You know, I think we can all agree that Eddie's got something wrong with him. He is a weird guy. But it is not a severe mental disease or defect. But even if you believed that, look at number 3. Did he know his conduct was wrong? And let's look, just like we looked at, did he commit this capital murder? Look at his actions and look at his words. So let's look first at his actions and how they showed that he knew what he did was wrong. What did he do? Even Dr. Rambula said that. Actions speak louder than words. It all comes from your brain. What are his actions? He went downrange and turned his back on Chris and Chad while they were shooting. And he knew they had guns, and he turns his back on them, yet he wants people to believe that he was afraid of these guys. You're not going to turn your back on two men with this arsenal of weapons if you're afraid of them. That's ridiculous. So let's look at this. Look at how the methodical, calculated nature of the murders. Waiting for the opportune time, like he said, for Chris's pistol to be dry. Waiting for that. Does somebody who's just out of their gourd insane do that? Wait. I know how many bullets that gun holds, and I know when it's spent. Here I go. He finished Chad off. That wasn't necessary. That was not fear. He did that out of anger. And then he loads that 9mm methodically, puts 15 bullets in it before he steals it and steals the truck. Took that 9mm with him. Why is he doing this? Why does he need a loaded weapon? What's going to happen? He stole Chris's truck and he fled the scene. He's not going to something. He's running away from something. He's running away from that bloody mess at the crime scene. And he fled 105 miles. You saw this. 105 miles from Rough Creek Lodge to his uncle's house, to his sister's house, to Taco Bell, somewhere in there is the dollar store, to his own house. From a place he'd never been in his life. Out in the middle of the country. Finds his way out of these country roads to the highway some way. Does that sound like somebody who is insane? Goes to Taco Bell. I mean, that's just incredible that somebody, you kill two men and you're going to go to Taco Bell. But I mean, think about that too. What does it take to go and order fast food? You've got to go through the right lane. You've got to place your order. You've got to interact with the clerk. You've got to give them the money, get your change, get your food, and go. It's not something that somebody that's just out of their mind delusional does. What does it sound like? It sounds like somebody that's got the munchies and they got to go get their Taco Bell. And he went and got his dog. And what's interesting about this Taco Bell receipt and how we know that this is him and not anybody else, because that time on that receipt, you know by 6:50, everybody else who's been in that truck is dead. And instead he wants to go to Taco Bell. But then you saw, how do you know he knew what he did was wrong? He gets in this standoff with the Lancaster police. And then you see this happen. Well, you saw that video. And you saw how he peeled out. He got rammed by that truck. And not only did he speed up, right after he gets rammed, there's that cloud of smoke, and he is hauling, you know what, to get away from those police officers. And he goes 100 miles an hour on a police chase with how many officers behind him, running red lights, going through stop signs. Why? Why do you run? Why do you run from the police? Because he knew what he did was wrong. Let's look at what he said. What did he tell people that indicates that he knew what he did was wrong? There's plenty of it. First, you heard from Deputy Cole. I shot him because they wouldn't talk to me. I was riding in the back seat and they wouldn't talk to me. They were taking me to the range. I feel bad about it, but I'm sure they've forgiven me. There's his motive right there. I shot him because they wouldn't talk to me. These two men that you heard, that's just their nature. They're not real talkative guys. They got killed for not talking to this guy. That's what he said. Not, I thought they were the hybrid pig people. Just shot them because they wouldn't talk to me. What did he tell his sister? I just committed murder. Murder is a crime. Using the word murder indicates that he knows he has committed a crime. And the fact that he used that word shows that he knew that he did something illegal. And when she tries to persuade him to turn himself in, what does he say? Nope, I'm in too deep. I'm going to run to Oklahoma to get away from this mess. Acknowledging that there is a mess to run away from shows you that he knew what he did was wrong. What did he tell the Lancaster Police Department during that standoff? Y'all want to barbecue my ass right now. That shows that he knows he is in deep trouble. He has the ability to negotiate this standoff. I'm not coming out. I know y'all want me to come out, but I'm not getting out because I'm in control in this truck. You know, he asked, y'all have guns? Well, so do I. He knew what was going on there. There were, 15 cops around him. What did he tell Ranger Briley? After you killed him, what did you do? I fled. Again, the use of that word fled and the actions of fleeing. You know, crazy don't run. He would have stayed there at the scene and said, hey, they were going to kill me. He ran away. Ranger Briley asked him, the reason you fled, because you knew that you did wrong. He says, I knew there was certain shit that was wrong about it. Well, Ranger Briley says, some of that certain shit was killing him. You knew that was wrong, right? And he agrees, right. Ranger Briley says, he's talking to him. Oh, and Eddie Ralph says, I'd like to hug my mom one last time. Because he knows he's going somewhere where he's not going to get to hug his mom for a long time. He says, that's because you knew what you did today was wrong. You shot Chris and Chad, right? Yep. What would you say to the families if you could? He says he'd apologize. Say, I'm sorry for what I did. If I could, I would have done it differently. Why do you need to apologize? You apologize when you know you've done something wrong. You tried to run from the police. And basically he's talking about the standoff. You weren't complying because of what happened. Yep. He knew why Lancaster PD was there. What did he tell Dr. Dunn, even his own doctor? These statements that Dr. Dunn wants you to ignore that show that the defendant knew what he did was wrong, he tells Dr. Dunn, it's a pretty shitty thing to do to kill someone. That's kind of a variation on the old Clint Eastwood quote. It's a hell of a thing to kill a man. Asked if he thought he made a mistake, he said, it says in the Bible not to kill anybody. He knows it's not just legally wrong, but what he did was morally wrong and against the Bible's principles. He told Dr. Dunn asked him if other people would understand what he'd done. What did he say? I figured I'd get arrested. He knew he had done something illegal because why else are you going to get arrested unless you know you did something illegal? He then tells Dr. Dunn, as soon as I did it, I knew I had made a mistake. I felt like I was defending my rights, but after I killed him, I felt this isn't going to look good. He's right about that. Then he went to Taco Bell and got the burritos because, in his own words, I figured I was going to get arrested pretty soon. Why does he think he's going to get arrested? He knows. Went and picked up his dog. Told Dr. Dunn running from the police was dumb. I drove recklessly. I endangered other people. He recognized that was wrong too. What did he tell Dr. Price? Other motives for what he did. He was mad. He was irritated about Whataburger. For some reason, most people find Whataburger to be delicious, but that irritated him for some reason. He was mad and offended that they didn't shake his hand. And you remember how Dr. Rambula offended him by not shaking his hand. That irritated him. That offended him. He felt slighted. He was mad they didn't talk to him. He was offended they didn't talk to him. He thought about killing Chad and Chris while in the truck, but figured that the truck would wreck and that he might get killed in that wreck. That doesn't sound psychotic or insane. That sounds actually pretty well thought out. What else did he tell Dr. Price? As soon as I shot him, I thought, Jesus Christ, what have I done? And I immediately became remorseful. Why are you remorseful? Because you know you did something wrong. I didn't plan it methodically, but in some kind of tactical scheme, I shot the target facing me, Chad, and then I shot the target facing away from me. Well, that's kind of bragging about his skill, but he's also telling a lie in there because you know from the evidence Chad wasn't facing him. He shot Chad in the back. And then he says he saw Chad on the deck shaking and convulsing. And he says this, I shot Chad in the head to keep him from getting up. And you know that that's a lie because there was no way on God's green earth that Chad was ever going to get up from that position on that shooting deck. And what does he tell Dr. Rambula? Oh, he admitted that he lied to a lot of other people about knowing that they were going to a shooting range. He said, I never told anybody else this, but I really did know that we were going to the shooting range. He's comfortable around guns. They want to make it look like, oh, he panicked around guns. But there was nothing that he ever told anybody that indicated that something out there alarmed him or made him afraid of the weapons. The guy's an armorer. You know, he loves weapons. That's it's life.
45.
He was comfortable. Thank you, Ron. Don't you know from everything you saw, everything you've heard, including those calls to the reporter, he was mad and irritated and offended at Chad's presence out there. You know, we heard him say over and over on that call to Nicholas Schmidl that he said to Chad, aren't you going to shoot? Aren't you going to shoot? Aren't you going to shoot? What are you doing here? This isn't a spectator sport. And then what did he say? Yeah, he watched his own death coming. Then what else did he tell Dr. Rambula? As he asked him, if you were so bothered by Chad, why not just shoot Chad? And he says, because if I shot Chad, Chris would have shot me. So he had to shoot them both. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not insanity. That is just cold, calculated capital murder. And he's guilty of capital murder. And he was not, by any means, insane.
Mr. Moore?
Thank you. Please, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I stood here a couple of weeks ago and told you that an absolute tragedy that happened down at the Rough Creek Lodge on February 2nd, 2013, down south of here in tip of Erath County. And it was an awful tragedy. You've You have now seen what happened down there. You've seen all the evidence. In a few minutes, you'll go back into your room and you'll just try to decide, why did this happen? Why on earth did Eddie Rowell shoot two men that he had never met before in his entire life? Was it because they smoked a couple of bowls of marijuana that morning and didn't shake hands with him and kissed him that he decided, I'm just going to kill these two guys? That's what they want you to believe, that he was intoxicated. Or was it because he was suffering from a severe mental disease or defect at that time, such that he didn't know what he was doing was wrong? Basically, that's what y'all have to go back there and decide. It's really pretty simple. That's the issue. I want to talk to you for a little bit about the judge's charge to you. You were told at the beginning that you didn't have to know any of this law, that the judge would give it to you, and indeed he has in this charge. And I'm going to go over it with you. There's some areas that need to kind of explain to you. And not that it's difficult to understand. He starts out by telling you here in the middle of the first page about an indictment not being evidence of guilt, presumption of innocence, and burden of proof on the state. That's really not important in this case. Usually in a criminal case, that's what we're fighting over. We've pretty well conceded. It's pretty obvious that Eddie Rowell shot these two men. But then in the next two paragraphs are perhaps the most important paragraphs in this whole document. Because number one, it tells you what your job as jurors is. And it tells you that you are the judges of the facts, just like you know. And what that tells you is the facts come from the witness stand. If they didn't come from the witness stand, you don't consider them. And it also tells you that the only thing that you are to consider are two things: the law and the evidence. Well, what that implies to you and what it tells you is, let me put it this way. When we try most criminal cases, that doesn't happen. There may be one or two family members out there, but this doesn't happen, folks. It's not on CNN every night. It's not out in the national media. This is. And I know you've been instructed not to read or hear or watch anything about this case. But when the judge tells you you are to base a decision on two things, the law and the evidence, that isn't to be considered. And you swore to us that you wouldn't consider that, and we're going to take your word at it. It also tells you not only the media, but the community. Keep that sneeze. This is a small community. It's a great community. But you can't go back in there and let that affect how you view this evidence, how you judge the evidence. You can't go out back in there and say, oh, I can't do this. What would I say to my neighbor? What would I say to my friends at church? You swore when you sat in this box that you would base a decision on the law and the evidence and not those outside forces. And we're holding you to it, regardless of what your verdict is. The next page, the judge tells you that, he tells you up here that give terms their common meanings that aren't defined. And he defines certain words in here for you. And if they aren't defined, you use your common everyday meaning. And we'll get to that in a minute on certain words. He also tells you in the next paragraph that while you're to only consider what the evidence is, you can draw reasonable deduction from the evidence. And that's just using your common sense. What you shouldn't do is fall into a trap of believing illusions and innuendos. If the evidence is there, if you want to draw a conclusion from it, that's fine. But certain things have been brought up in this trial that are just not based on what the evidence is. You remember Miss Starnes told Eddie said something about voodoo at one point in time. And she asked the witness, well, he went to Haiti, didn't he? Well, there's no basis in evidence to think that he knew voodoo or practiced voodoo from Haiti just because of that. And this wet marijuana that's just been saturated in this trial. Eddie said, well, it may have been something, it may have been Purple Heart. The chemist told you it was not soaked with anything. It was just plain old marijuana. So that's what I mean about don't be falling prey to the innuendos and the illusions. Base any kind of a decision on valid deductions of the evidence. Then he tells you that if you want to see some of this evidence out here, you're certainly entitled to do it. Just send a note out, and you'll be able to see it if it's an evidence. He's allowed you to take notes, but sometimes there's an actual disagreement or conflict in what people think they heard. The only time that Tommy here can read back any kind of information to you is if y'all have a conflict or a disagreement. So make sure before you waste your time that there is a disagreement. He tells you about the defendant's right not to testify. And that's a cornerstone of our criminal justice system and our Constitution. He even tells you that if somebody gets back there and says, well, I sure would have liked to have heard what he had to say about it, the foreman is supposed to say, stop, we can't talk about that, we can't consider it for any reason whatsoever. That's what the judge tells you the law is, and that's what you have to follow. Then he tells you about some what we call extraneous offenses. Extraneous offenses are other crimes, wrongs that you may have heard of that are not capital murder. And the judge tells you in here there's only one thing you can use that for, and that's what he tells you, whether it's motive, intent, those kind of things, you can read it. That's what that means. Now, on the top of the third page in the second paragraph, he tells you that two important things here. He says there's three possible verdicts in this case. Come on, there's only two. There's not a not guilty in this case, okay? We'll concede that. So you're going to be looking at guilty of capital murder or not guilty by reason of insanity. Those are the two things, two verdicts that are possible in this case. But he also tells you in that paragraph that you can return a verdict either way, either not guilty by reason of insanity or guilty of capital murder, only if all 12 of you agree. It has to be unanimous. And what that means is this. If you're back there and 8 of you for one way and 4 of you for the other way, the law contemplates that you try to talk it out and come to some kind of unanimous agreement. But sometimes you can't. That's just all there is to it. You can't get to a unanimous verdict, and that's okay too. That happens in criminal cases. The thing that I want you to know is don't violate your conscience just to make somebody else happy and switch it. If you have a conviction one way or the other, don't violate your conscience by switching just to go along with the crowd. We ask you in void ire, if you're the kind of person that would stick to your guns and you truly felt the way, and that's what that means. And then he actually defines some terms for it. He tells you what the definition of capital murder is, what criminal transaction under our law means, what intentionally means and knowingly. Then he talks about intoxication, and that voluntary intoxication is not a defense of commission of a crime. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. Then there's a special provision in this paragraph about you can consider all relevant facts and circumstances surrounding the killing, if any, and the relationship that existed between the people, and the facts and circumstances going to show the condition of the mind of the accused at the time of the killing. And that is a special murder provision in our law. And it allows us to show you what was going on in Eddie's mind when he shot those two guys. Then it's called an application paragraph at the bottom of that page, and it tells you about all the elements of capital murder. Then on the top of the next page, here is insanity, okay? And the judge tells you it's an affirmative defense to prosecution that at the time of the conduct charged, that means at the time of the pulling of the trigger. That's when you look at, that's the time that is of importance that you look at. That, and you've heard this, as a result of severe mental disease or defect, that he did not know his conduct was wrong. Now, you've heard wrong is case law defined. You'll see in here that Judge Cashin did not define what wrong means for you, because it is not defined under our penal code. And so if you follow his instructions, you give wrong its common meaning. Not unlawful, not illegal. You use wrong the way you would in any other situation in your common everyday affairs. Now, we know we have the burden, and it tells you right here that we have the burden to prove by preponderance of the evidence that Eddie was saying insane at the time that he shot them. And you'll remember that, and the judge will tell you in here, that a preponderance of the evidence means simply the greater weight of the credible evidence. It's a civil standard, not a criminal standard. It's like when people have car wrecks and one of them sues the other for damages. All they have to prove is the other person was at fault by 51% or the greater weight of the credible evidence. And you'll remember that's your job to determine what is the credible evidence regarding our burden of proof.
15.
Thank you. And then here's the whole crux of the case, number 6, circle number 6, because it tells you that if you find from the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed capital murder as alleged in the indictment, but you further find by preponderance of the evidence that at the time of the conduct charged, as a result of mental disease or defect, he did not know his conduct was wrong, you will find him not guilty by reason of insanity. Next paragraph says, if you don't believe we proved it by a preponderance of the evidence, you find him guilty of capital murder. Simple as that. Now, number 7 will tell you that you can't consider during your deliberation, when you're back there tossing around this evidence, you can't consider the potential consequences to a person, to the defendant, if you find him not guilty by reason of insanity. You were told at the beginning that if you find Eddie guilty of capital murder, his sentence is an automatic life sentence without the possibility of parole. That's our law. No punishment, no stage, no nothing. It's automatic. Judge Cashin sentences him right then. We can't tell you by law the result if you find him not guilty by reason of insanity. Now, I want to talk to you just a few minutes about voluntary, well, the rest of it is some simple instructions that you can read back there once you pick the form. But what we get back to is this voluntary intoxication. And let me tell you, we're not, it's not our position that Eddie was even intoxicated. That's their position. We're saying that if you look at the time, that morning, Uncle Jamie comes over and they smoke a bowl or two of just regular old marijuana. And he said, finally, he told Ranger Briley, well, that may have been 30 minutes before Chris Kyle came to get me. Or I asked him, he said it could have been an hour, could have been 2 hours. But if you look, and everybody's testified, well, regular marijuana may last 2 to 4 hours. And if you look at the timing, this incident had to have happened around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Because you know where they are at 3:15. And to go set up, it had to be around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I submit the effects of marijuana would have worn off. But I want you to consider something else when you consider the credible evidence. Eddie was talking to Ranger Briley about 11:30 at night. And you can look at that videotape and you can see the delusional gibberish that he's talking at 11:30 at night. He and Mr. Nash, the district attorney, are both there at the Lancaster Police Department. There is a judge at the Lancaster Police Department. He's ready with his pen in his hand, ready to sign a search warrant. In fact, he indeed signs a search warrant for the search of Eddie's house. And you know that out at that crime scene, they collected every shell casing, they collected every fiber, every bullet, went to Eddie's house, collected everything they could, went to Chris Kyle's truck and collected every single piece of evidence. But yet they're sitting in the Lancaster Police Department with Eddie sitting right there in the room with a judge in the next room, enough probable cause to get a blood sample from Eddie, and they decide not to do it. And you know from their own Dr. Price, you can analyze blood and see how much THC is in it. Yet they made the conscious decision that night not to get a sample for y'all. It would have been the simplest thing to go to that judge and get it and have it analyzed, and you would have that evidence. we would have that evidence. But they decided not to do it, and yet they want to stand here and tell you how intoxicated he was. But didn't go get a sample of his blood to show you if he was or not. So when you're looking at the credible evidence, keep that in mind. So I guess the bottom line is, did we prove to you by the greater weight of the credible evidence that Eddie was insane as defined at the time he took their lives? And we brought you evidence through his mother that Eddie was going along just fine. He was going through life. He was happy-go-lucky. Yet he went to the military and came back and fell off. That's what their Dr. Price told you is a sign of mental illness. And he went to the VA in Green Oaks 4 different times, was diagnosed with some kind of psychosis, given psychotic medication. And the January 19th incident, you know he wasn't smoking marijuana during that psychotic incident. And we brought you Dr. Dunn, who works with schizophrenics every single day of the week. And he has for 20 years. They brought you Dr. Price, who's a nice man and a smart man and a good psychologist, but he doesn't deal with schizophrenia. And he has only diagnosed this cannabis-induced psychosis one time in 30 years. And they brought you Dr. Anna Bula, who's president of the Medical Association in Texas. Sounds like that's about what he does most of his time. He's not dealing with patients like Dr. Dunn does every single day. And Dr. Dunn told you Eddie's suffering from schizophrenia. You have the tapes you can look at of afterwards of Eddie's interviews at the various stages that night. So did we prove to you with credible evidence, the greater weight of the credible evidence that he was insane at the time? Absolutely. Thank you.
Police Court,
You may.
counsel, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. First, I suppose you should be thanked for your service. I'm an Erath County boy, born and raised, and I know for a fact that your fellow residents are proud of you for doing this job, because it's not an easy job, and we all know that. Regardless of what the outcome of this trial is or your verdict is, to a man, every single resident is proud of you. And you've done it with dignity and class. And I thank you for that. I'm going to be up here a little while because this was a pretty long trial, and we're going to go over some of the facts in this case. We're going to go over some of the reasons why somebody might spin it one way or another. Tim talked to you about innuendo. If counsel for either side attempted to intimate some detail about this case on a PowerPoint slide or otherwise, and it's taken out of context, or it might be somebody's remembrance of how somebody said something, whether it may be in dispute whether they said it at all or not, I want to remind you, anything that the lawyers have said in this case is not evidence. Okay? And I know there's a mound of it, and you may have to go back and look at some of that. One glaring example, okay, and this is a typical example of how we want to insinuate that somebody said something they didn't. Dr. Aaron Beulah said, Eddie said the marijuana was probably wet. On the slide we just saw in her closing, she said Eddie said it could have been, in quotes, okay? That may not be a huge deal to some people. It may be a huge deal to some people, but it's an example of how we take things out of context, okay? And that one's on videotape. All right? So you can go back and take a look at that and find out if the slide was right, or if Dr. Aaron Beulah was right, or if I'm right. Okay? So you can go back and look at it. All right? The video doesn't have a dog in this fight. All right? It's objective. Most of what witnesses say have some subjective amount of perception to them. Okay? And I'm going to get to Ranger Briley and Ranger Armstrong and Laura Blevins, and I'm going to get to all those people in due time. But just in response, as another example, okay, about how we spin things or we put those innuendos out there. Taco Bell. Okay? And I'm not saying it's wrong, but you could certainly take the position, as the state has, that because Eddie Ray Ralph could negotiate the drive-through at Taco Bell in Red Oak, Texas, well, he must have had organized linear thought, because he could negotiate not only the drive-through, but he could order what he wanted. And maybe because he received the receipt, that also indicates some sort of organized linear thought. But from the state's perspective, that's something they just argued to you. He couldn't possibly be insane because he can negotiate the Taco Bell drive-through in Red Oak, Texas. And the reason I bring that up is just to illustrate any single purported fact, whatever it may be, could be looked at one of two ways. Now, some of them are easier to do than others. Certainly, I would submit to you that somebody who's just shot and killed two people, if they're actually fleeing, we don't stop at Uncle Jamie's house. We don't stop to get a Dr. Pepper at the Dollar Tree. We don't stop at Taco Bell. If his intention is actually to flee to Oklahoma, you don't run by the house and pick up your dog, go around the block a few times to find a couple of friends to talk it out with, and then show back up at the house when the police are sitting there. You don't think he saw him when he's driving up? He knows Jesse. That's his neighbor. Detective Shavera. He's not fleeing, he's going home. And then that's the point. The point is, the state says, well, he fled, he's guilty, he knows what he's doing is wrong. He's not fleeing, he's going home. And the criminally insane that wasn't actually fleeing to Oklahoma would go pick up their dog, leave, drive around, look for a friend to talk it out with, and then show back up. I submit to you that fact in this case, the second time he goes back to the house in Lancaster on 6th Street, certainly could be interpreted as evidence that he is disorganized thinking. One of the symptoms, as Dr. Dunn and the other doctors told you, of a severe mental disease, schizophrenia in this case. Now, let's kind of roll through this and as best we can chronologically, because you were told in the opening, we're going to observe the conduct before, during, and after. Okay? On the one hand, you got conduct, all these actions and words. Okay? And that was one of the slides that Jamie, let's look at actions and words to try to figure out what the issue is in this case. Okay? So you've got, in one sphere over here, you've got all these actions and words, and then this other sphere over here, you've got all these guys with letters after their names giving you what their opinion is. Okay? And really, they're basing their opinion on two things. Actions and words. Okay? Some clinical testing, but mostly what people say, including Eddie, and what they saw. Okay, I reviewed all the police officer reports, reviewed all the videotapes. Everybody reviewed everything. Also reviewed all the medical records from the prior doctors at all the VA hospital in Green Oaks. Okay, so and some of that was done a while back, and some of it was done 3 weeks ago. Okay, Dr. Ambula was out there the last week of January this year. And so, and there's been a lot of testimony about the change over the 24 months and the antipsychotic medications that he's taking and when the dosage was doubled. And so we're going to kind of run through it. And there's a limited amount of time. All right, so I apologize to Tommy and I apologize to you now. But I'm going to try to roll through this in a limited amount of time. And I may misspeak, but you're going to know what I mean. All right? So, here's what we know. All right? We know we've got Eddie Ralph, troubled veteran. Okay? After high school, goes to the Marines, gets out, and we've got a troubled veteran. And the state would have you believe that he's not psychotic and that he's setting up his own defense once he starts to get interviewed by the police. And you heard Warren ask Dr. Dunn, well, he must have been brilliant to know you were coming a year in advance when he, starts his pig references. But there's other examples. And there's some strong evidence there. He went to the VA in July of 2011. And you remember delusion? A fixed false belief? You're confronted with evidence to the contrary. No, Eddie, you don't have a tapeworm. Okay? Eddie had a delusion. Eddie was delusional as far back as July 2011. Thought he had a tapeworm. So, I don't know if it started years or months or weeks, but I suspect, and I submit to you, the evidence indicates that Eddie started to show signs of a psychosis. I'm not talking about a mood disorder, all right? I'm talking about severe mental disease or defect. This schizophrenia started, and undisputed, that's the prime age that someone develops schizophrenia. Eddie's right in the center core, right in the heart of it when all this starts. And he has this delusion about the tapeworm. He goes to the VA for the first time after he got out of the Marines in 2010. And you know the history. I'm going to go over it with you, but it kind of goes downhill from there. So after he has his delusion in 2011, he rocks along there. Of course, the reason that delusion is important is that they're going to tell you later on, hey, he's setting up his own defense. He's going to claim he's crazy to get out of trouble. But it just doesn't make any sense that if he goes as far back as 2011 with those trips, that he would think that far ahead. And Dr. Price tells you, and like Tim told you, he's been doing this 30 years. Actually, he's diagnosed 2 cannabis-induced psychoses, but one was after it. Okay, so Tim Bright, I think 34 years of practice, and in all that time, he's diagnosed 1 cannabis-induced psychosis. And Dr. Dunn told you it's rare. Jamie told you it's rare. And not only that, it's the rare exception of cannabis-induced psychosis if it continues on past today. And we'll get to that January 19th incident here in a minute. But so cannabis plays a big role in this thing. And I think it's abundantly clear that most of his adult life, Eddie smoked marijuana. And I also think that it's fairly undisputed that everybody that knew Eddie said that marijuana calmed Eddie down and helped him relax, and that he didn't have violent outbursts that sent him to the VA over that. I actually think that was probably some evidence that there was an adverse effect on Eddie when he drank too much. And I think that there's some evidence that the family fish fry, that he drank too much and he got drunk and he got in a fight with his dad and he had had an episode there. I don't know that that's a psychosis. I mean, but certainly there's some evidence that he didn't handle his alcohol very well. And certainly, if you think he's drunk on February the 2nd, it certainly would have been helpful. I mean, for every single misdemeanor DWI nearly in the state of Texas these days, we get a blood warrant to go draw blood for a Class B misdemeanor. Some Tarleton kid gets drunk, gets pulled over, and without a doubt, if they refuse, the vast majority of those get a warrant signed to draw their blood. Nearly all of them. And it's extremely easy to do. It's really easy to do when you got a judge sitting in the jail ready to rubber stamp anything you ask for at that point. Because you got 2 dead bodies in Erath County that you're investigating. So ultimately, Dr. Dunn opines this is rare, and Eddie actually exhibits the symptoms more than 2 of the 5 required under the DSM, the Bible or the psychologist and psychiatrist, of schizophrenia. It's virtually undisputed that he's right there in that wheelhouse for the age that somebody that develops schizophrenia would develop schizophrenia. And ultimately, we know what his opinion is. His opinion is that the mental disease or defect was so severe that Eddie didn't know because he was delusional, because he thought that he was going to be killed, and that wasn't the first time that Eddie thought he was going to be killed. I mean, he at least on 2 other occasions thought that he was going to die. Maybe not be killed, but he was going to be dead when he woke up on one occasion. And at another occasion, he thought he was going to die. So he's clearly delusional and has been at least since July 2011 with some frequency. And on February the 2nd, he was delusional about whether or not he was going to live or die. And some of the actions and words that we're talking about, of course, you see some of them on video, but you see some of the things that are talked about around that time, and even later, about what he could smell in the air, that he could smell love, he could smell hate. Then he wasn't sure if he was smelling it coming from them, he wasn't sure if he was smelling it coming from himself. But that's a pervasive theme throughout the entire trial about what he could smell in the air, or what he could smell. And that's another example of him being delusional and interpreting what he thought he smelled. Dr. Price would have you believe that that's cannabis induced, but there's so many examples throughout the trial where it didn't have anything to do with that, where he could smell something without regard to that. So these events began to unfold in the weeks leading up to that fateful trip down to the Rough Creek Lodge shooting range that sort of paint this picture of a young man that's suffering from paranoia, suffering from schizophrenia, suffering from this severe mental disease. And the time immediately leading up to this, Jen Weed's at the center of it. Okay, she's his girlfriend. She's with him off and on when he's not in the mental hospital, and she at one time was his girlfriend, but she really doesn't have anything to gain, if you think about it, from coming up here and making anything up. Okay, and she's called as a state's witness. And she's under subpoena, and she takes the oath, and she sits up there. And of course, you know, she's the last person with him that led up to that last commitment in the hospital, which ended just 8 days before this trip to the shooting range, right? And she describes a whole bunch of things going on with Eddie, and she denies that there was any marijuana use leading up to that incident. But you start just look at actions, okay, actions and words, and you start looking at some of the actions, and keep in mind, you know, this is a couple of weeks before, so if he's tipping his hand, okay, if he's setting up his own defense, he's having to anticipate some things. You know, she describes him at this point leading up to the shooting as catatonic. She describes him staring at the wall. He's in tears. He's laughing.
20 minutes.
Thank you, John. And then she describes an incident where she let him borrow her brother's shirt, and he's fine. 1 minute, she's getting ready. The next minute, he's visibly shaking, and he's sweated through. I mean, we're talking sopping wet, sweated through the entire shirt. Okay, I think it was a light blue polo. First of all, that's going to show that you sweat pretty good. Probably it's a short sleeve shirt. And this is January. Of course, it's probably warm that time. Not so much this week. But she describes him as doing all that. And then shortly thereafter, we have the incident where she says he's not violent and he's not threatening, but he's paranoid. I mean, he's standing over there peeking out the window with a ninja decorative sword, and eventually at some point, for whatever reason, gets a butcher knife out of the kitchen block, out of the knife block. And he's looking out the window, and he's saying, no, we're not leaving here. They're going to get us, okay? And if you go back, just as a general overview, and look, there's repeated references, and there's references from the doctors that he had a paranoia about the government and about people trying to listen. And Jen even talked about the incident where he put his hand over her mouth. She's trying to have a conversation with him, and he gets a legal pad and starts writing down. No, he puts his hand over her mouth because he thinks they're being listened to. It has nothing to do with smoking marijuana. Okay? And it has nothing to do with setting up some sort of defense to some criminal activity that's going to occur in the future. Okay? What it has to do with is Eddie having schizophrenia. And, you know, he goes to the hospital. They again prescribe antipsychotic medication. I think this time they double it. So now we're up to like January the 30th. And Jen would see him again. And he would propose. And then he tells her to kick rocks. Get out. Next morning. Just typical riding that roller coaster of emotions. Never know from one day to the next. And so she leaves him with Uncle Jamie. And we all heard that testimony. Okay, Uncle Jamie's up here. There's a lot of assumptions made about when he smoked that marijuana. That's an area of dispute. And Tim touched on it. But Uncle Jamie left at 8. Eddie got up before 4 that morning. They ate breakfast before 5 that morning. You know, she got him showered. He hadn't showered in weeks. All right? Take that for whatever it's worth. And Uncle Jamie says, I live 45 minutes away. I left around 8. Okay? Give them the benefit of the doubt and say he left at 9. All right? They talked, drank coffee. He doesn't remember if they drank whiskey or not. Eddie says they did. I don't have any idea how much whiskey was in the bottle that morning when they started. But he said he had drank whiskey the night before. So they have some talks about advice on women. They have some talk about spiritual things. And I think he said he even played him a hymn off his phone that he had recorded. But they talked about that. And they may have talked 15 minutes. They may have talked an hour and a half. I don't know. And I submit to you that there's not any evidence in this record to suggest when those 2 bowls of marijuana were smoked. But I will submit to you that somebody that smoked marijuana most of their adult life and smokes marijuana sometime that morning has some tolerance for its effects on you. Was certainly not intoxicated at 3:45, 4 o'clock, or 4:15 that afternoon down in Erath County, Texas. And I also submit to you that there were witnesses that took the stand that were asked, you know, would Chris take somebody to the range that showed any kind of sign of intoxication? And I mean, you talk about red herrings. Throwing alcohol into the mix is a red herring. I mean, that's just another thing the state can throw out there to try to get you to bite on. But they certainly had the opportunity to pull the split if they wanted to, but they didn't. There's no evidence to suggest that Chris Kyle or Chad Littlefield, for that matter, would have taken somebody to the range that smelled or showed signs of intoxication. And, you know, James, he says the marijuana is just plain old good marijuana. The first person to suggest that this marijuana was wet was Ranger Brown. Okay? And that's part of the slide. Of course, they were taken out of order. That conversation was taken out of order, out of context. And when he says, you know, was it wet? Eddie said, it could have been. And he asked Eddie, after every question, you knew what you were doing wrong, right? You ran from the police because you knew what you did was wrong, right? And Eddie said, right. He said, yes, sir. Let me just pose this question to you. If Eddie's truly crazy, what good does it do him to ask that question? If he really doesn't know the difference, what good does it do him to ask the question? That answer is not dispositive of anything. If he doesn't know what he's doing, he's not really capable of answering that question. That's just like asking if the sky's purple. Regardless of what his answer is, it doesn't get you anywhere. Okay? Doesn't make it any easier for you to answer the issue. So, they decide, as Tim told you, in their wisdom, that they're not going to pull his blood. They don't need it because they got Ranger Armstrong out there searching the house, and he's found a grinder, a pipe, a broken pipe, and a little bit of plain old marijuana. Okay? Now they certainly, the innuendo and the suggestion was PCP, LSD, embalming fluid, formaldehyde. Of course, embalming fluid and formaldehyde are the same thing. Fact of the matter is, you can't dip marijuana in formaldehyde and keep it for a while and then go smoke it later. The fact is, formaldehyde is so volatile that it evaporates quickly. If you try to preserve it with the marijuana in some sort of airtight container, it's going to mildew and you're not going to be able to smoke it anyway, right? So formaldehyde needs to be dipped and then smoked. So, I don't know. I'm trying to figure out why in the world Ranger Armstrong testifies under oath that he collected 2 vials of clear liquid, found them in Eddie's house in the metal box. Unless that's an insinuation that it's some other substance. Because that mess had to be fixed. Because the lab tech was fixing to come up here and say, no, I put those in there. Despite the fact that he swore under oath that he collected those in Eddie's house, the state had to take those out of evidence out of that exhibit. We also heard from the Lancaster PD. You can watch those videos again if you need to. Submit to you that he's not intoxicated. He does appear to be paranoid and disorganized in both his thought and his speech. There were autopsies, the shell casings. There's a Spiron space-age 360-degree camera. The Secret Service. You've got all these law enforcement officers at the disposal of the state. And the Secret Service brings you this text message that says, Chris Kyle, text Chad Littleton, dude is straight up nuts, all right? And the state talked about that on their closing. Chris sent that text message. Chris Kyle sent that text message without the benefit of any psychiatrist's opinion. He knew it without seeing any of these videos or interrogations of Eddie Ralph. He knew it without knowing how many times he'd been in the VA hospital or Green Oaks. And there's not anybody here, there's not anybody that doesn't wish that these deaths could have been prevented. As Jane said, but the state certainly wanted Chris Kyle to have the benefit of knowing all that stuff because, and how do I know that? Because when Jody Ralph was on the stand, when she's on the stand, they asked her 15 times, don't you think that would have been good information? Don't you think you should have told Chris Kyle that Eddie's crazy? That's basically what they asked her a dozen times. Over and over, every time that she took the stand. And the state wanted that and they demanded that. She should have warned him. And the fact of the matter is you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't ask Jody Ralph to warn Chris Kyle that he was crazy. And then ask this jury to not find him crazy. Thank you.
How much time do we have left, County?
Doing the math right here.
I'm sorry, Jim?
I'm doing the math right now.
Oh, yes.
34 minutes.
Thank you, Honorable. Please, the court.
Yes, sir.
Members of the jury, I'm not going to take all of my time because I suggest you've been diligent and deliberate in listening to all the evidence in the case. But let's go back and think about the testimony of the experts. Here's what's neat about trying a lawsuit. You get to use your common sense. Remember during voir dire, I said, could you be steadfast in what you believe and not be swayed by what others want you to believe? And I also said, think about this, and think about it now, because when I said it to you, you didn't realize this. You'll never have as much power today as you ever had in the rest of your life, because your power is real. Think about it. How much power the 12 of you have to make the correct decision in this case. Think about it. And I'm not from Stephenville. I've had the privilege of trying cases here before. And I will tell you that you are blessed to have Judge Cashner as your judge. I try cases all over the state of Texas. I try cases in federal court. You are blessed to have him as your judge. He's the judge of the law. You're the judge of the facts. You get to determine what the truth is. Think about it. You determine what the truth is. Do I believe Dr. Dunn? Do I believe Dr. Price or Ramula? All three professionals make different diagnoses. Excuse me? Two are psychiatrists. Two are medical doctors and one is a psychologist. Dr. Price is not a physician. He doesn't prescribe medicine. He gives tests. Use your common sense. Dr. Price talked about a cannabis-induced psychosis. Anybody ever had a beer on this jury or consumed any wine? Common sense. At 4 something in the afternoon on February the 2nd, how in the world was Eddie intoxicated? How? Because the law is, at the time of the event, did he suffer from a severe mental disease or defect? He didn't know his conduct was wrong. You know why? Because he went to Taco Bell. They want to focus on Taco Bell so much. It's so simple. He didn't know his conduct was wrong because he went to Taco Bell. It sounds silly, but it's true. It's absolute. Why would a man who just killed 2 people go and get something to eat? Not because he thinks he's going to go to jail or prison, because he didn't know his conduct was wrong. That's Eddie when he was in the Marine Corps as a young man who wanted to be a success for this country, like Mr. Kyle was and Mr. Littlefield was. He didn't kill those men because of who he wanted to be. He killed those men because he had a delusion. I want to say it again. He killed those men because he had a delusion. He believed in his mind that they were going to kill him. You know, we have a state-of-the-art crime scene guy get up here and talk about what could have happened. What could have happened? What could have happened? It's all conjecture. It's all speculation. You take those crime scene pictures back there, you look at what happened. Eddie took their lives because he thought they were going to kill him. Not because he rode down Highway 67 in Mr. Kyle's black Ford 350 jacked up truck. He didn't know these guys. Never met them in his life. They were honorable. They were trying to help a veteran who Eddie's mother sought out at the Midlothian Elementary School. He was doing a good faith deed and he lost his life. Eddie didn't know these men. So the inference that I find it somewhat shocking that the state of Texas wants you to believe that Eddie killed them because he didn't, Mr. Collins shake his hand, they went to Whataburger, he's jealous. That is outrageous. It's offensive. It's absolutely offensive to believe that. And you know, the state doesn't have to prove motive. They're trying to show you a motive why he killed them. You know why? You know why? They have to show you something because they know he's been ill. They know he's been ill. And they're so worried that you're going to believe the testimony of Dr. Dunn that he was psychotic. See, let's flip it around. Let's focus on he's a bad guy. Mr. Collins, shake his hand. That is outrageously offensive to pure logic and common sense. What do we know from Warren Blevins? And look. Do I think you should smoke marijuana? I'm a good Southern Baptist. No. Do I think you should get drunk? No. But I can't control someone's behavior. We know Laura Blevins has seen her brother intoxicated with alcohol before and high on marijuana. What does she say to the authorities? I looked at his eyes, and for a second I saw Eddie again, but then he wanted money. Folks, that's psychotic, delusional process. That's schizophrenia. That's not intoxication with marijuana. That's not my brother. That's not the man depicted in that exhibit that she saw that day in her house outside in Midlothian. And look at the delusion. Look at the delusion of Eddie's mind. And he is not sophisticated enough to plan a defense. That is beyond comprehension. He's that sophisticated he can plan his defense. He's that sophisticated over a year before Doctor's done sees him, he talks about pig expect shit. He's not that sophisticated. Look what he tells Ranger Briley, who's sitting right there. Look what he tells the Ranger. And I have great respect for that Ranger. He did his job, but guess what? He can't change what was in his mind. He can't change what Eddie thought. Raleigh asked Eddie, so you saw your sister today. What'd you tell her? I told her, listen to me, I told her I had to kill men today. It wasn't a want to, it was a need to. Does that make your skin crawl? I had to get out of that situation I was in today. If not, this is his mindset. I was going to be the next one out there and getting my head shot off completely, getting my head completely off, you know. He's not that sophisticated, folks. As Mr. Moore did state, we're not contesting, and the state did a good job of legally establishing beyond a reasonable doubt that he killed those two men in the same criminal episode. We're not contesting that. What you need to look at, and the judge is giving you the instructions, which is of course charged. Now, bearing in mind, this is the law. You'll take it back and you'll pick a foreperson. I suggest, if you want to, you look at every piece of evidence in here, but especially every video. That showed you who Eddie was. The Eddie you saw on February the 2nd, 2013 is not the same Eddie over there. You know why? You know why? Because he's taking his medicine. Why would you prescribe antipsychotic medicine to someone who's not psychotic? Why? If the state wants you legal to drug-induced psychosis, why do you still have the medication? Now, bearing in mind the foregoing instructions, if you find from the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Eddie Ray Ralph, committed the offense of capital murder, he did commit the offense of capital murder, as alleged in the indictment, but further, now listen to me, but further find by a preponderance of the evidence, the burden is on us, the greater weight of the evidence. It's a civil burden of proof. That at the time of the conduct charged, the defendant, that's Eddie, as a result of severe mental disease or defect, did not know that his conduct was wrong. Then you will acquit the defendant, say by your verdict, not guilty by reason of insanity. Here's the privilege about being a citizen of this community and a citizen of Texas. As I talked about during Ward Hour, my family's practiced law in this state for 119 consecutive years. But guess what? Your integrity is the most important thing, and your honesty to the oath you took as a king. And as Shay talked about, you're going to go back to the community and you're going to go to church and go to work, and guess what? You be steadfast in what you believe in and not be swayed by what others want you to think. Because I asked everybody individually that question, and you all said you could do that. So how do we know he suffered from a severe mental disease or defect at the time of the offense? Use your common sense. The state has two experts, but it's bizarre because they don't agree with each other. It's kind of weird. You sponsor an expert who doesn't agree with one or the other. Dr. Price, who I've known for a long time, says it's a marijuana-induced psychosis, but look at his actions. And the idea that he goes down range, and first of all, there's no way he went down range while they're shooting. Where did that come from? I never heard any evidence about that. there's a lot of inferences the state likes to make, and I will say Mr. Nash, I have respect for him, and I think he's a good prosecutor. There's some inferences that really bother me in this trial, though. The question Mr. Nash asked to Donna Taylor about Eddie at work, where he is having these catatonic states. Well, he must have been catatonic because he's smoking pot at work. No, he's not smoking pot. And Mr. Nash asked a question about, well, did he go out in the back and smoke pot with some employee? Donna Taylor, no, he didn't do that. I've never heard of that. That's a false impression the state wanted you to have. They want you to have a false impression about the marijuana being lit because it makes Eddie look like he's intoxicated. Nope. No evidence of that. Now, I will say, to his credit, for the record, Mr. Nash is the one that discovered those vials in that evidence. That was a mistake by the lab person. But here's what's very bothersome. Very bothersome. A ranger in the Dallas section of the Texas Rangers testified under oath that he took the vials from the house.
You have objection, Your Honor, that was not the testimony of the ranger, and he knows it.
Sustained.
The bothersome thing is Alan Nash paraded in front of you a vial and asked the ranger, is this the kind of thing you stick a syringe in? Inference? False inference. False inference. Not in evidence, improper. Dr. Dunn, let's think about it. If you're going to have a house built, do you want someone that knows how to build a house or someone who has some idea about building a house? I want to pick someone like Dr. Dunn that actually sees patients and works on folks that are mentally ill. Arambula, what in the world does he do? He's president of the medical board that gives exams to people that want to be doctors. How does that deal with psychosis and schizophrenia? And I asked Arambula all these examples, and he says, well, it could have happened, it could have been, it might have been. He couldn't answer anything. Well, he was a waste of time, folks. What did he tell you that helps you at all? Nothing. He told you absolutely nothing was beneficial. Well, Mr. St. John, I might need more information than that. I might need this, I might need that. And to say it's a mood disorder? It's not a mood disorder. It's a psychosis based on schizophrenia. Randy Price talks about marijuana-induced psychosis, and I'm about to sit down because I see y'all are getting tuckered out, and we got to go a little bit longer. How would you be able to shoot a gun like you did, which is horrible? Think about this, and go back and look at the pursuit. You put whatever label you want on it. Eddie didn't want to go to jail. He realized that part of it. Go back and look at the pursuit. How do you drive a truck like that if you're intoxicated? He was not intoxicated, folks. He was psychotic. Go back and look at the tape of the conversation that the officer had with him in the truck before he took off. That's psychotic. Testimony from the DPS Rangers and all the folks at the scene. You smell alcohol on him? No. Did he smell like marijuana? No. This is a tragic situation for my client, his family, for Mrs. Kyle, her children, his parents, Mr. Littlefield's family, his parents, his wife, his child. It's tragic. We can't change what happened. But you have to make a decision based on the law and the evidence. So here is the issue. At the time of the offense charged, did my client suffer from severe mental disease or defect? And did he not know that his conduct was wrong? That's the issue. I said, then once you deliberate, you can only come to one conclusion. You'll choose your foreperson and go back and make a decision. You have to have the integrity to follow your beliefs. The integrity to follow your conviction. Did the state prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that Eddie killed those two men on that day? Yes. Did we prove to you beyond the preponderance of evidence that on that day, February the 2nd, 2013, that he suffered from a severe mental disease or defect and did not know his conduct was wrong? Yes. So on the verdict form, it's the last thing that the foreperson has to sign. Can't tell you where he'll go. We can't tell you that. The law doesn't allow it. Do I agree with that? No, but I'm not going to take it. You can figure that out.
Ladies and gentlemen, this defendant has gone to the deep well of excuses for his violent behavior one too many times. And it is time for it to end right now, right here. We have heard for 2 weeks excuses after excuse after excuse for violent behavior in this case, as well as all those cases before. This defendant gunned down 2 men by shooting them in the back, and then Chad Littlefield in the back of the head, and then twice in the face and the top of the head. And if they're going to ask you to say he gets away with that, make them convince you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the problem with the defendant's excuses that you've heard repeatedly over the last 2 weeks is he can't keep them consistent. Just like a typical liar or a typical performer. The performance or the lie depends on who the audience is. What we see is a performance on the day he was arrested. We see him purposely evading questions of Ranger Briley by changing the subject and saying outlandish, bizarre things. We see him in the back of a patrol car, just fine, not muttering to himself, not bothered by the police outside, not bothered by the lights going on, but as soon as he has an audience, I feel psychotic. I feel paranoid. I feel schizophrenic. These words start rolling off his tongue. But let's talk about the myriad of excuses he's used time after time to try to avoid responsibility. And make no mistake about it, ladies and gentlemen, what they're asking you to do. They're asking you, by asking you to sign that last form on the verdict, they're asking you to find that he's not guilty, that he's not responsible for what he done. And if they're going to ask you to do that, think about all that this defendant has proven himself capable of. We've heard about psychosis, NOS, and we've heard about schizophrenia, and we've heard about cannabis-induced psychosis, and all these different things. We heard for a while about PTSD until 3 experts finally told you he lied about his military history, he lied about his PTSD, he lied about having an ailment on every single portion of his body to get his benefits. All that finally went by the wayside. But it is time for his deep well of excuses for violent criminal behavior to come to an end. In September of 2012, he threatens to kill his family. And what do we hear? We hear, I'm military. I have PTSD. I can't help myself. And what happens? He doesn't go to jail. He goes to the mental hospital. He gets clean off dope. He gets out. Goes right back to it. In January 2013, just before all this happened, he holds his girlfriend and her roommate hostage with a knife and a sword, to the point that the roommate was so frightened that she ran out the backyard and jumped a fence even before the police could arrive. And what does he bring out? I'm military. I have PTSD. And he avoids jail, and he goes to the mental institution. He goes to Green Oaks. He gets cleaned up for a few days, gets off dope for a few days, and what happens the very day he's released? You heard Jen Weed testify to a lot of different things, and she tries to protect him the best she can when they called her to the stand. But one of the most telling things we learned about this defendant is in January 2013, after he cleans up, gets sobered up, in the mental institution, in the VA mental institution, What's he do the very day he's released? One of the biggest fights he and Jen have is over what? She goes to see him the day he's released from the mental institution. And where is he? With Greg Lindemood, his dope dealer. The day he's released. The day he's released. And, you know, we can go through, I don't want to keep you all day because you've heard 2 weeks of testimony. We could go, you know, tit for tat, to use the phrase of the defendant, tit for tat on every little point and every little diagnosis. But every single time this defendant ended up in the mental hospital, tested positive for cannabis. Every single time. And every single time, those doctors diagnosed him with some condition or psychosis, NOS, not otherwise specified, which you now know is doctor code for he's got symptoms, but we all know the root of the problem. The guy's a doper. He will not stay off dope. We're not talking about the casual person who smokes a joint in Colorado once in a while. People can differ on whether that should be appropriate. We're talking about hardcore cannabis use. And every time he goes to the doctor, to the hospital, that's positive. And they diagnose him with psychosis, NOS, or mood disorder, and it's all traceable to that. But that's really fine and dandy. You know, we have all this talk about the doctors. And you know, I listened to it just like you have, lived with this case for 2 years. In all candor, I'm a little tired of a couple of things from this defendant. You know, hundreds of thousands of men and women have served us in the military. And they've served in combat, they've served in bases, they've served overseas. And they don't ask us to tell them, because you served us, you're not responsible for what you do. They don't ask us that. Because, let me pose this to you. The minute we start saying, if you serve us in the armed forces, we can't hold you responsible for your crimes afterwards. That is also the moment we tell our armed services and we tell the men and women who serve us, ladies and gentlemen, we can't trust you. And I'm not ready to say that. I'm tired of that being proposed to us. And I'll tell you another thing I'm tired of hearing the last 2 weeks of this trial is that people who deal with mental illness in themselves or in their families, their churches, their workplaces, that they expect to not be held responsible for what they do when they commit crimes. I'm tired of hearing that. Because we all deal with this. Some of us have heart disease, some of us have cancer, some of us have diabetes, some of us have mental illnesses. And we are good citizens, and we are good neighbors, and we are good friends, and we're good fathers. And I am tired of the proposition that if you have a mental illness, you can't be held responsible for what you do, because what next step from that? The next words that will roll off the tongue after you say you can't be held responsible is, we can't trust you. And I cannot stand for that proposition. We cannot stand for that proposition. So the deep well of excuse making by this defendant has to come to an end. And the big problem with his excuses is they don't match. We hear his rather wild performance for Ranger Briley on February 2nd, the night of, when he knows he's in a bind. He just murdered 2 men in cold, calculated blood. Cold blood, he gunned these 2 men down. And he's acting crazy for Ranger Briley, particularly when he asks him hard questions like, where did you shoot Chad? When he knows the answer's in the back. But a mere 13 days later, and he's not talking to the police, and he's not talking to the defense attorneys, and he's not talking to his psychiatrist whom he needs to convince you to let him get away with murder. When he's not talking to them, but instead he's talking to a reporter from the New Yorker, what do you hear? You hear a cogent, articulate, in control man talking about, here's what I need to get out of here and do some writing and get my story out. February the 16th. It's amazing how he recovered from that psychosis that Dr. Dunn has seen. It's amazing, too, that just a few months later, when that reporter gets a hold of him again. We have a series of conversations and we talk about the details of the crime. And you heard just today the 13-minute call when he's not talking to the police, and he's not talking to his lawyers, and he's not talking to the psychiatrist he needs to convince you to let him get away with murder. What does he describe? He describes riding in the car, getting angry, getting ticked at Chad. What's this mother effer even doing here? He's just watching. And I took care of business. He watched it. He watched it. His true colors came out then, ladies and gentlemen. His true colors came out then. He watched it. Ladies and gentlemen, you've learned a lot about what this defendant's capable of. You learned he's capable of gunning down 2 men in the back. You learned how he's capable of executing a man while he's down. And you've learned that he's capable of dreaming up excuses to get his hide out of trouble at the convenient times, depending on who the audience is. If he's talking to his psychiatrist, whom he needs to convince you to do this, or he's talking to the police, whom he needs to convince he's crazy, he's crazy. When he's taking the story out with a reporter, hey, it's almost bragging. I hopped in the truck, put in an effing bip, and took off. He wasn't one bit sorry for what he did. You know why? He knew it was wrong. Because that's what this man is capable of. And I'm kind of tired of talking about the defendant. I want to talk about a profile in courage for a moment. Something you heard about 2 weeks ago. You heard in that witness stand a young man named Justin Neighbors. He's the Rough Creek employee who drove up with 2 other folks, a father and his 10-year-old son, and found this horrific scene that we've had to subject you to for 2 weeks, this horrific scene. And this young man, not knowing who did it, not knowing where the killer was, sends the father and his 10-year-old son, get out of here, get back to the base, tell him what you saw. And once he do, he stays there. And he heroically tries to save Chad and Chris. That's a profile in courage. Send the father and send the 10-year-old back. But I want to back up a little bit, and I want to ask you to visualize something. And I want to start with one of the exhibits that we gave you. And that's the picture of the back of the shooting sports range. Now I want you to visualize something. You've seen the horrific murders that occurred there. You've seen Chad and Chris brutalized by this defendant. And now you know, through the evidence, that after he shot Chad and Chris, he takes the gun he used to shoot Chris, puts it right up on the deck above the head of Chad Littlefield as he bled and died. And he stands over Chad Littlefield as he's bleeding and dying. And he pulls out the magazine out of the 9mm. And just like Clay Jeffers showed you, he one by one reloaded that thing with 15 rounds. And you saw how long that took. Now, I want you to visualize this. What if Justin and that father and that 10-year-old boy had been a little early? Now that you know what this defendant is capable of, is there any doubt in your mind?
I'm sorry, that's improper argument. That is absolutely outside the record.
Overruled.
Is there any doubt in your mind that this picture right here would be different? The father, Justin, and the father, and the 10-year-old. Would you be hearing from this defendant that Justin had a pig face, or that the father?
Most respectfully, Judge, that is improper argument. The court knows that's outside the record. I object.
Overruled.
Now do you know what he's capable of? Would Justin have a pig face? Would that father have made him mad because he refused to shake his hand? Would that 10-year-old boy make him fear for his life? Fast forward, Lancaster. Is there any doubt now that you've heard the evidence of what this defendant is capable of and the excuses he will sling up before you when he's in a bind? Is there any doubt in your mind that if those officers at Lancaster were out of bullets, or if those officers had their backs to him, is there any doubt in your mind what this defendant would have done with that 9mm and that 30-06 Remington 700 that he had right there at his disposal in the truck? And is there any doubt now that you've heard him sling a variety of excuses here in front of you, trying to get you to bite on this? Is there any doubt in your mind that we'd be hearing about how those police officers had pig faces, or that they were the wolf in the sky about to fly? Is there any doubt in your mind that we'd be hearing some excuse about how he was afraid of them? Now, miraculously, he didn't shoot them because they had bullets in their guns and they had their faces to them. And miraculously, when the truck finally, as he's on his way to Oklahoma, when that truck finally gives up the ghost, this insane man who can't control his actions, and this insane man who's afraid and having delusions that people are out to get him, this insane man, the minute the brake lights come on that truck, what happens? That door swings open and the hands are out before his body. The jig is up. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the behavior of a sane man. That's the behavior of a control man. And then the show begins. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I asked you in the opening statement, as you heard the evidence, to consider two core questions. Did he intentionally or knowingly kill these two men, these two fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers? Did he intentionally and knowingly kill them when he shot them in the back? And at the time, did he know his conduct was wrong? Two simple questions. Now, we've heard 2 weeks of evidence, excuses, justifications, and diagnoses, and all those things. But let's face it, this case comes down to those two questions. And this defendant's conduct speaks louder than his words, because his words change, as we've already established. You can't count on his words. And this is just an aside, but even his own doctor had to come around and acknowledge he lies to him. He didn't tell the truth. How do you base a diagnosis on something that when the doctor's not even, you're not even telling your doctor the truth? But so his words really have no meaning because they change depending on whether he's talking to a reporter, to a police officer, or his psychiatrist that he needs to convince you to let him off the hook. Let's remember his actions. Their defense is really built upon this delusional belief that Chad and Chris were gonna kill him. Let's look at the scene. Look at the scene, ladies and gentlemen. You want your answer? Look at the scene. 2 bullets to the back of Chad Littlefield. He's down on his knees. 6 bullets up the side and back and in the side of the face of Chris Kyle. He's face down in the ground. Who's going to hurt him now? Who's going to hurt him now? 2 bullets to the back. Chad is down on his knees, gasping for life. Hand in a pool of blood, clinging to life. He rolls onto his back. Rolls onto his back, ladies and gentlemen. And this man, who's afraid of guns, by the way, this man who's afraid of guns, it's not enough to make sure he doesn't hurt me. No, I want this man dead. Jane told you he's dead, 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 dead. No, he wasn't afraid of Chad Littlefield laying on his back, paralyzed, bleeding, clinging to life. He wanted him dead, 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 dead. And that's what this defendant is about. He's gone to the well, the deep well of excuses for his violent behavior too many times. It's time for it to stop. This defendant gunned down 2 men in cold blood, shooting them in the back in our county. Find him guilty.
All right, I've been advised that the jury's reached a verdict. All right, we, the jury, find the defendant Eddie Ray Routh guilty of the felony offense of capital murder as charged in the indictment. That verdict is signed by Ms. Stafford as foreperson of the jury. All right, Mr. Routh, if you'll please stand again. Having received and accepted the jury's verdict in this matter, by statute, I will now impose sentence in this matter at confinement for life in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice without the possibility of parole.